The boardroom smells of lemon polish and expensive cologne. Crystal light cuts across the table like a clean accusation. Men in tailored suits talk over one another, their voices clipped by numbers and forecasts, their hands never touching the mop bucket parked against the wall. At the far end of the room, beneath a portrait of smiling donors, Alexandra Ashcroft laughs and reaches for her glass. She is the kind of woman the newspapers call a philanthropic mother, photographed with ribbons and babies, quoted on panels about compassion. She is also the reason half the floor believes their paychecks are safe. Across from the glitter, Bernard Kellerman sees the small person beneath the public image. He sees the pulse stuttering under the silk blouse, the way he'd seen it in the community CPR class 3 years earlier, between a broken dishwasher and a pay stub. He sees the face of someone who needs air. When Alexandra slumps forward, conversation stops like a recorded line cut mid-sentence. The microphones mute. The CEO's assistant screams once, too loudly, and then everyone is suddenly in motion, except Bernard. He is already on his feet. He is not supposed to be there. He is the night shift janitor, the man who comes in after hours to vacuum the crumbs of other people's meetings. He is the man who learned CPR in a church basement because Molly, his 6-year-old, once choked on a coin, and he needed to know how to pull breath back into a child who had gone still. He thought he'd learned the technique for his daughter. He did not imagine ever needing it for a room full of donors. He kneels without thinking. Hands find rhythm, head tilted, a stern command to someone to call an ambulance, and a softer one to keep a pillow steady. The boardroom watches him like they watch the weather, briefly interested, then bored. A security guard reaches forward with a liability badge flashing. "Sir, step back." "Don't move her," Bernard says. He is breathless, not from exertion, but from the shock of being in between two worlds. He does chest compressions. He feels the ribs give and press under his palms. He counts under his breath, the numbers steadying something inside him that keeps time with her pulse. The glass of lemon water slides, untouched. Phoebe, the PR director, is already on her phone, thumbs moving like a surgeon cutting fruit. The ambulance sirens are far away in the sound of things. For a moment it is only Bernard and the woman who had collapsed, in the small, steady math of compressions and mouth to mouth. He tastes antiseptic on his lips, tastes the room, perfume, graphite, the clean leather of agendas. Alexandra coughs. Her eyes open to fluorescence and white tiles where the portrait promised a life. The boardroom exhales relief like a synchronized audience. Then the security man grips Bernard's arm so hard his knuckles blanch. "You can't be here," he says, not politely. "You were seen touching her."
"We have to detain you until we know what happened." No one thanks him. No one offers to take his shirt, because the soap from his hands smells like work, and he is not part of their world. Cameras recorded everything. Security footage is tidy, authoritative. It slices the scene into frames that will be retold for days. The same footage will be replayed in 1,000 different lights. "Step away, sir," says a board member, and there is a smile on his face that has practiced sympathy. He is thinking about investors and optics, even as paramedics wheel Alexandra away. Bernard is pulled toward the corridor. Muffled voices trail behind him, orders, questions that feel more like blanks being filled in. He is ushered to a small security room, a place for cameras and keys, and the slow breath of people who watch other people. Someone calls HR. Someone calls the press office. The word incident travels up the elevator shaft. The title that will later be scrubbed into headlines hovers in the air like a dust mote. He saved her life. They fired him for it. A thumbnail of the future is carved into this moment. A man in scuffed boots, hands on a woman's chest, while the powerful avert their eyes. It will be cropped, edited, described, and then turned into something that fits a narrative those in power are comfortable with. Disorder, danger, an unruly employee. It will not be allowed to stay as the messy human thing it was, a person helping another person. Bernard stumbles home with a paper cup of coffee someone from the paramedics gave him. He walks under the city's indifferent streetlights and thinks of Molly sleeping with one stuffed toy and a grin that thinks the world is fair. He keeps his head down. He has been told, repeatedly and politely, that his presence is a liability at the company. "We have to put safety first," the HR rep said on the phone, her voice lacquered with empathy that never touched his shoulders. "Effective immediately, Bernard. We are letting you go." His supervisor, who had shrugged while he knelt, reads from a prepared statement. Not "thank you," not "you saved her," Those words, which would have rewritten everything, feel absent, as if they evaporated the minute the camera stopped rolling. Instead, an email circulates with a still frame from the security feed, Bernard's hand near Alexandra's neck. A headline is drafted that suggests the kind of headline that gets attention. It implies more than it says. The first ripple of the smear is quiet. A hashtag sprouts, #boardroom breach, and then a chorus starts to hum under it. Someone edits the clip into a loop, a short that appears to be repeated pressure where there was instead care. In the era of fast outrage, nuance is the enemy. The single frame from the security camera is dressed as proof. When the wave hits the timeline, it does not discriminate. People Bernard has never met leave comments with the surety of jurors. There are calls for his arrest.
There are people who invent details and others who interpret. A friend from the factory where Bernard had once worked messages a simple prayer and a request for details. An older neighbor, Janet Holloway, brings over a casserole and a stack of flyers, part community support, part neighborly worry. Bernard's landlord calls about rent. The bank calls about overdraft fees. The nights stretch long. Molly asks questions that patch him like a bandage. "Daddy, why are people saying bad things?" she asks, hand small in his. He has to explain the internet to a 6-year-old, the way you explain storms. Some come and some fall away, but we cannot stop the rain. He teaches her to put her toothbrush back in its cup and to close the curtains, so the world outside looks like a storybook for a child who needs the world to be kind. Meanwhile, in Hospital Wing C, Alexandra wakes to a different kind of silence. She is not alone. The room is full of the polite attention that money can buy. Soft linen, a private nurse with a precise manner, but there is a hollowness that no concierge can fill. She keeps replaying the moment in her head in flashes. Hands, the smell of disinfectant, a second of not knowing. Her chest is tight in a way that isn't all about the heart. It is a moral tightness, the weight of how she imagines she is perceived, the friction between the portrait and the working machinery of the company she runs. Phoebe, the PR director, insists gently on talking. "You were incredibly lucky," Phoebe says, rehearsing grief management like a liturgy. "We need to control the narrative. There are frames already out. We'll put out a statement, fortunate to be okay, and we'll humanize you, Alexandra. People love motherhood narratives. We'll put you with Molly's dolls or the charity luncheon. We can steer this." Alexandra wants to believe it. She wants the narrative to be gentle, to close the book on what almost happened by giving the public the comfortable version. But there is a fragment in her mind she cannot let go of, the full security footage. She had caught only the final bits when the boardroom cameras fed into the stream of her memory. She felt a pressure there, a detail that did not match the edited frames she was seeing on her phone. At night, she wakes and sees a man kneeling and thinks of a child's coin and a church basement class. On a quiet afternoon, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the careful distance of her hospital room, Alexandra asks for the unedited footage. It is an act that changes the arc of everyone in the building. The footage is nothing like the cropped clip. It is longer, messy in ways that editing cannot be. Hands check for breathing, there is a brief commotion when paramedics cross the threshold, and someone drops a folder, someone else knocks over a glass. But the heart of it is not ambiguous. Bernard is compressing and calling for help. He steadies ahead, barks orders in a voice that is older and rougher than most in the company. The executives behind him are frozen in place, some on their phones, faces drained of consequence. There is a moment, half a second, where a hand reaches for a phone rather than for a shoulder. There is the flinch of a chair when someone chooses image over action. Alexandra watches and feels guilt like a fulcrum. She knows, in a sudden, nauseous clarity, what it means to be visible and to be invisible. Bernard had made the visible choice, and they had made him invisible afterward. She does not know at first what to do. There is a phone call that she has to take for the next investor round, and a board meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. There are sponsors who donate to the foundation she sits on, as if charity were a shield. There are also men like Tyler Brigham, the CFO, who have spent a decade learning how to shape narratives and place blame where it cannot boomerang. Tyler is not a man who likes awkward details. He is the kind of executive who knows how to file a statement so it reads like compassion and a strategy in one sentence. When Alexandra asks him about the footage, he is smooth as ever. "We can control the story," he says. "We put out a quick release, grateful to be okay, and we pivot to a human interest angle. People need heroes. We give them a script. We donate to a first responder fund. We make it feel like we care." But there is a second voice in the room as well.
The voice that says, cautiously, that the public sometimes turns against the powerful even when they are victims, and that optics can erode a brand overnight if you let anger find a foothold. The safest option, Tyler argues, is to change the frame before someone else does. We create a narrative where Bernard is the grateful underdog, he insists. We have him do a short piece, public, contrite, thankful for the company. People will see him as human, and he'll be taken care of. It transforms liability into content. Phoebe nods, though her eyes flicker when Tyler speaks. She is always keenly aware of how stories travel. We can place it with morning shows, she says. A viral clip about gratitude. It's the kind of content that converts sympathy into comfort. Alexandra wants to do the right thing. She does not want to be the kind of person who co-opts a life for public consumption. And yet she is tired. She is scared. She has 100 stakeholders and a foundation that relies on a steady heartbeat of donations. She pictures headlines that will freeze investments and calls from trustees asking why the portrait of charity on her mantle has cracks. When Tyler proposes the line, have Bernard sit in a stage space, a coffee cup in front of him, and speak about his gratitude, Alexandra hesitates. Tyler softens it with the language of rehabilitation and redemption. We'll frame it as a way to lift him up, he promises. We can arrange support.
We can make this about him, not us. But another, less advertorial version of Tyler has been at work behind the scenes. A week earlier, after the paramedics left and the boardroom had closed, he had leaned on HR and whispered about damage control in a way that sounded less like concern and more like containment. He had drafted internal memos that recommended limit access, suggested Bernard's termination pending investigation as a way to signal action to angry stakeholders. He had placed a still from the security footage in a press folder with a caption that implied assault without making any legal claim. He had called a couple of local influencers, floated a feeler about public sympathy for a CEO who needed time to heal, and asked what a narrative might look like where the company looked both responsive and benevolent. Tyler sees the world as a ledger. For him, a reputation is an asset to be hedged. He understands how quickly markets pivot when stories bend against them. He does not, however, understand the particular moral danger of staging a human being's humiliation and then expecting the public to accept it as charity. He thinks in spreadsheets. He believes in moves that reduce variables. Alexandra, exhausted and with the rawness of being nearly dead, is vulnerable to being persuaded. She consents to the idea not because she is calloused, but because she is scared. Scared of investors pulling, of the foundation being shuttered, of her life collapsing in a way that will not be forgiving. She authorizes a human interest piece. The company will place Bernard in front of a camera and ask him to speak with gratitude. We will support him, Phoebe says. We'll offer a fund to help with his rent. We'll put him in programs. We'll be seen doing good. Bernard is reached by a young producer sent by the company. She shows up at his small apartment with a bright smile and a clipboard. The kitchen is cluttered with children's drawings and unpaid notices. Molly is at the table, drawing a sun. Bernard readies himself the way a person prepares for weather. He folds his hands, practices a voice. He does not understand the calculus that will ask him to perform thanks in public while his life is being dismantled. The first meeting is polite. They sit at his kitchen table. Bernard hears phrases like help, support, platform. The producer shows him a storyboard, a soft focus clip of him with Molly, a close-up of him counting the coins in a jar, a gentle voiceover about gratitude. They ask him to speak to the camera about how grateful he is that Alexandra is alive, to say how she saved them, to explain how the company has been so kind. There is an offer, too, financial help, a referral to an advocacy group, a small one-time stipend that will pay a month's rent and a little breathing space. The ask, when it comes, is gentler than the idea Tyler floated. They say it like a favor. We'd also like to include a moment with a tip jar, the producer says.
We thought the visuals would resonate. It's human, it's humble. People respond to vulnerability. It will be a moment where you can ask viewers to donate to the relief fund for first responders. You can frame it as a call to kindness. Bernard stares at the phrase tip jar. He had once pushed one at a corner diner, the clink of coins a small, reliable proof of human exchange. He understands what it symbolizes in a world where work is not seen. He also understands humiliation in an intimate, personal way, how it felt when a foreign had once made a joke about his boots in front of the plant. He imagines himself with an open palm in front of a camera, and in that image he sees the faces of his daughter, and their landlord, and the bank, and an online crowd that will interpret that gesture finally into a verdict about his character. He asks the producer, Is this for real? What will they say? His voice is small in the apartment. You'll tell your story, the producer replies. You tell people what happened. We'll make sure you come off as the hero you are. We'll make the fund live. We'll make it work for you. Words like platform and fund and support are slippery things. They sound like generosity. They also sound like contracts. Bernard hears neither contract nor guarantee. He hears a chance, maybe the only one. His rent overdue notice waits like a patient animal on his kitchen counter. He imagines Molly's shoes with holes, the winter creeping in. He imagines being unable to get a job because of the smear that keeps repeating on timelines where nuance is starved. He thinks of the nights when his throat burns from not being able to tell a child that the world will be okay right now. He thinks of choices, not of dignity or humiliation, but of outcomes. A warm bed this month, or the slow shiver of eviction. He agrees, quietly, not because he wants to beg for tips, but because he is tired of being invisible in all of the ways that cost him: sleep, stability, the ability to promise his daughter a home. The shoot is staged in a rented studio that smells faintly of coffee and latex. A backdrop of soft gray is hung, and a cup is placed on a table, clear plastic, businesslike. The lights are warm and built to flatter. A camera sits like an animal waiting to be fed images. Alexandra is present. She says she wants to meet Bernard, to look him in the eye and hear his story. She speaks to him from her place of new vulnerability. Her voice is measured. She is careful to use words that will sound like repair. "I owe you my life," she tells him. "You were courageous. We should have responded differently." Tyler hovers, as all handlers do, making sure angles are covered and the company's legal team is looped in. He sits at the fringes, counting like a man who measures risk in percentages. Phoebe stands close to Alexandra, moving like a shadow that keeps light in place.
The producer asks Bernard to smile, to recount the moment, to mention he took a community CPR class. She tells him what to do with his hands. She gives him optional lines to read. "I was scared, but I did what I knew. I did it for my daughter." She mentions the tip jar again, saying it will appear at the end of the segment as a call for viewers to contribute to the First Responders Fund. The money, they promise, will go to those who need it. Bernard's mouth feels raw. He repeats the lines the way a singer repeats a chorus. He looks at Alexandra across from him, and there is something heavy in her eyes. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps the labor of putting oneself back together. He thinks of Molly in her small bed, painting suns. He thinks of the landlord's voicemail again. He thinks about dignity versus survival. When the camera rolls, he tells the story in a flat voice that is stitched together with fatigue. He references the class. He says simply, "I did what I had to do." The lights pick out the tired edges of his face. The producer nudges him gently, like an off-camera nurse guiding breath. At the end of the take, the director says, 5 more seconds. Look into the lens and tell them what you would ask of people." The line is supposed to be a gentle ask, a call to donate, a signal that this is a journey toward restoration. Bernard glances at the tip jar sitting in a corner. It is shiny and absurd and humiliating all at once. He pauses. He thinks of his daughter and of paying rent. He thinks about the way the press will read any sign of weakness as confession. He chooses the simpler honesty of need. "If you can spare it," he hears himself say, "help keep my little girl warm. She needs school shoes." His voice breaks, and for a long second the camera lingers on his face. That single human moment, the cut of a voice, the flash of a hand out, will be the line Tyler hoped would steer the narrative. The company will edit the footage into a minute-long clip meant to be heart-tugging. The CEO saved, the janitor grateful, the corporation compassionate. The piece is crafted to make everyone feel good, except it contains an element that cannot be scrubbed away. Power always sits in the foreground of generosity when the cross-section is watched closely. The release plan is meticulous. Premiere on a morning show, then push to social platforms with a friendly caption and a link to the fund. Tyler's memos anticipate praise. "This will humanize our brand and convert sympathy into support," he writes. Phoebe schedules the media round and double-checks the talking points. The clip drops with calculated timing, a weekday morning when eyes are mobile and outrage is mostly asleep. At first, the feel-good reactions stream in, 100,000 views, comments saying powerful and grateful she's okay. There are a few empathetic notes. "What a man. We must protect people like him."
Bernard looks at the feed with a hollow relief that feels like relief, but is threaded with something tighter. But the internet is a room that rewrites itself. Within hours, someone threads the company video next to the original security stills in a side-by-side montage, and something shifts. People begin to notice what the staged footage leaves out: the absence of the boardroom's initial frozen inaction. The edit that implies Bernard's plea is his own idea rather than a coerced performance. A blogger with a small but merciless following posts a thread that reads like a slow peel-back. Notice how the company frames his gesture as gratitude. Notice what's missing.
The thread gets traction. A local reporter scrambles through the security camera metadata. She finds discrepancies in timestamps and uploads that suggest parts of the original footage had been withheld from public view. She tweets a calm, clinical line. Producers sent staged clip. Original security footage shows much more. The first cracks appear as questions. Why was the original, longer recording not released? How much did the company shape the narrative? Why is a man in need being asked to ask for money in front of a polished set? Conspiracy hedges the edges of the conversation. The hashtag of sympathy folds into something angrier. Hashtag staged sympathy begins to trend. People feel the visceral wrongness of being made to ask on camera, and they conflate that wrongness with the company's broader practices. Inside the company's PR tent, the mood cools. Phoebe checks the analytics like a person reading a rosary for signs. Tyler calls for a meeting. "We can control this," he says. The old steady voice turns sharp. "We go on the offensive, release the unedited footage, show we had nothing to hide. We highlight the aid package we've established." But the thought of the unedited footage terrifies Alexandra more than the staged clip. The unedited footage shows the boardroom freeze, the shaky hands, the unwillingness to intervene. It shows the choice that was made not to act until the story could be contained. It shows that the company's attempt to orchestrate contrition might have been a bandage over the deeper wound. It shows the executives stepping away from their moral obligation, and that sight is a kind of contagion for public trust. The morning turns into a long afternoon of calls and countercalls. Investors taste air. Donors who once loved Alexandra's smile begin to ask neutral-sounding but pointed questions. At the same time, a slow but unmistakable moral revulsion starts to gather outside the polished studio, people intoning with the moral fervor of those who find dignity in authenticity. You don't ask someone to beg. Bernard, watching the swell from his smartphone, feels a new kind of sickness. The comment sections he had been clinging to for warmth now pulse with something angrier.
He had thought the staged clip would be a lifeline. Instead, it has become a spotlight that puts him in a position no one should have to be in. He was asked to perform gratitude, the way someone might be asked to perform their own exoneration. To the algorithm, his need is clickbait. To the camera, the tilt of his head is a narrative hook. The first journalist who sniffed a story publishes a piece that is careful but pointed. She mentions Tyler by name, traces the PR timeline, and hints at a culture inside the company that privileged image management over human care. Her piece is not a verdict. It is an invitation for others, employees, former staff, anyone with an inside story, to come forward. And then the calls start to come in. "Bernard," says Janet, the neighbor, on the phone, "you should be careful. People are talking." Molly asks him if they will still have a home. He is not ready to tell her the truth about what a loss of dignity does to a person. He does not want her to grow up thinking that holding one's hand out is the only way to be seen. He wants to show her that there are other ways to be visible besides asking for pennies. In the company's offices, board members begin to whisper about donors. A foundation that had several corporate partners pauses a scheduled gala. A major sponsor requests an emergency call. The stock, if you call it a living thing at all, fidgets. It is not that Alexandra is suddenly evil in anyone's ledger. It is that the machinery of how narratives shape value is suddenly visible to people who measure in dollars. Money listens when reputation speaks, and now reputation is giving a testimony that unsettles those who once believed its polished voice. Tyler speaks to legal counsel in a voice that is low and careful. "We can manage this," he says. "We will issue a statement, announce a review. We'll have Alexandra make a recorded comment, apologize for any perception of exploitation, and offer the full footage for transparency." Alexandra contemplates the idea of releasing everything. She imagines the footage like an incision, something that would be both hurtful and honest. She wonders whether truth can be built as a PR strategy. She is learning that there are things no media plan can mend. She begins to understand that what happened in the boardroom, what did not happen, is not just an embarrassment, it is a symptom. That night, Bernard sits on his building's cracked stoop and thinks of the camera's bright eye. People on the internet are starting to talk about bodily autonomy and dignity. Some say he should never have agreed. Others say the company coerced him and that his consent had the same weight as a folded piece of paper. He thinks of all the overnight shifts sweeping up other people's leftovers, of learning CPR in the church basement because you cannot rely on institutions to protect you, of a 6-year-old who needs a new pair of shoes.
He thinks of Alexandra, who he has only ever seen once, under the bewildering light of mortality. He wonders if, in another life, if power and humility could be reconciled, someone would have reached out with a real hand rather than a camera. He thinks about whether the world will be kinder after this, or if the spectacle of his need will merely make for better advertising. The next morning brings a colder wind. The staged clip is still trending, but with a new texture, a thread of condemnation that is spreading like ink in water. Small nonprofit partners hesitate. A charitable trust requests an explanation of the company's vetting procedures. A board member's spouse calls a newspaper with an anonymous tip about the company's internal notes. On his phone, Bernard sees the first wave of messages that change everything. Tweets that call out the executive who had insisted on the staged clip. A leaked memo that suggests some of the company's statements were drafted before the unedited footage was reviewed. And a screenshot, one that will hurt, showing Tyler in a recorded meeting saying, simply, "This will put the story back in our control." That line lands like a stone. Control is the word that corrodes. People begin to ask what else was controlled. The story's orbit expands. Journalists who had once skimmed the surface decide to dig a little deeper. Anonymous sources at the company send in emails suggesting a pattern: complaints ignored, maintenance staff undervalued, an HR department that filed grudging sympathy on paper while cutting actual support. Bernard reads the headlines on his peeling couch and feels a rush that is not just relief. There is a vindication brewing, yes, but there is also the sick understanding that his life has been used as a device to cover a wider rot. He did not want to be a lever for someone else's apology. He wanted a job, a home, the quiet steadiness to teach his daughter about a world that does not always fold its hands into someone else's palms. In the middle of the growing storm, Alexandra calls him. On the phone, her voice is small and not entirely familiar. "Bernard," she says, "I watched the full footage. I'm sorry. I made a choice, the way people make choices when they are scared for their name." He hears the weight in her voice, remorse like weather. He hears also the tremor of someone who is beginning, reluctantly, to feel the consequences of image-driven decisions. He does not know whether to respond with gratitude or with the coldness of someone who knows the press will parse every syllable. He chooses neither. He tells her simply, "Let's talk when this is calmer." As the line goes quiet, the world keeps adjusting around the story. The morning shows debate the ethics of staging vulnerability. Columnists weigh the architecture of corporate charity. Tyler, in the depths of his spreadsheets, runs a new model that calculates risk in the wake of the leak. A donor pauses a pledge.
A legal counsel drafts a line about ongoing review. Bernard stands at a window in their apartment and looks at the city, thinking of all the small movements, sweeping, shoveling, carrying, that keep a city functioning. He thinks of the janitors and the nurses and the truck drivers whose faces are not on billboards but who carry the world without applause. He thinks of the choice he made in the boardroom and the way choices ripple. When he goes to check the mail that afternoon, there is an envelope from the company. He opens it with a cautious hand. Inside, there is a brief letter that gives him the name of a fund, a pledge of temporary housing support, and a promise to review internal protocols. It reads like a concession crafted by lawyers, warm enough to be printed on letterhead, careful enough to leave the company in the safe middle ground between culpability and compassion. It is not a solution, but it is an acknowledgement. For Bernard, acknowledgements matter. For Molly, they will become the difference between warm shoes and cold toes. For the public, acknowledgement is the first break of a larger architecture of truth. Outside, movement accretes. The journalist who first hinted that the footage had been edited is now asking for interviews with employees who handled security. A former administrative assistant writes that the company often deferred to the optics of donors when choosing what to prioritize. A former board member posts an anonymous blog about how donors' expectations can shrink the soul of a nonprofit. The story stretches like a net, and the men who had tried to control the weave find themselves on the wrong side of it. Tyler sits in his office staring at a cascade of media mentions. He makes a few calls to foundation heads, tries to soothe a donor who is now asking direct questions. Behind him, the portrait of Alexandra on the wall seems smaller, like a painting washed in light. And yet, even as the evidence of manipulation begins to circle the building like a storm cloud, there is danger in the way people measure. Alexandra, confronted with the unvarnished version of events, chooses at first to make amends within the existing system. Funding for Bernard, a statement about transparency, "We will do better," typed into a press release. It is generous in shape, but it bears the imprint of the institution that gave it life. She does not know at this point whether those gestures will be seen as earnest or as a new layer of image management.
The project that Tyler had assumed could be contained suddenly begins to look like a tinderbox. The staged clip, instead of being the bomb, has become a match. The match burns into place a pattern of questions that will not be smoothed away by soft lights and gentle talking points. People begin to see the structural logic behind the staged asks and the neat press releases. Those in power can always create a narrative to protect themselves.
When the narrative fails, the collapse is not always dramatic. Often, it is a slow, public unweaving, a hemorrhage of trust that shows up in bank statements and paused grants, and the reluctance of longtime donors to sign another check. Bernard watches this unfold with a mixture of dread and an odd, familiar resilience. He has known what it is to be overlooked. He has known that the world sometimes takes you and frames you for convenience. He has also learned from the church basement and the nights awake with his daughter that there are certain things you can choose that keep you human. That evening, he sits at the kitchen table and opens the laptop the company has given him access to, temporary for the sake of editing any commentary he might wish to record, and he reads through the comments, the op-eds, the threads. He does not want to be used. He wants his story to be his own. Across town, in a conference room that smells faintly of coffee and manufacture, Tyler presses send on an email that will go to 200 addresses, a calm and architected explanation of the company's action plan, immediate review, transparency, donor engagement. He includes a talking point about unintended perception and the company's commitment to do better. He does not understand that the language of unintended perception will be read by many as a way to minimize the hurt they had caused. He is not yet tuned to the moral pitch of a public that wants not only money but responsibility. As the evening deepens into something bluer and colder, a new player emerges from the crowd, a mid-level reporter in a newsroom 2 blocks over who has spent months covering corporate practices and who has a memory of being a janitor's son. He emails a colleague. There's more here. Security logs show edits. Let's ask for the metadata. If there's smoke, there's fire. The next day promises a new kind of intensity. The staged clip, meant to shepherd sympathy, has instead opened a door for journalists who smell an institutional pattern, and Bernard, who had been asked to hold out his hand into the camera, finds himself at the center of a debate about dignity, power, and how stories are made. When he tucks Molly to bed that night, she squeezes his finger and says simply, "Daddy, will we be okay?" He smooths her hair and does not say what okay might mean in the weeks ahead. He says instead, "We'll keep doing what we can. We'll be honest." She believes him. His honesty is a bridge. There is a private moment, after the lights are out, when Alexandra sits on the edge of her hospital bed and considers the portrait on the wall, the one with her smiling and a child in her arms. She thinks of all the ways power can look like kindness and all the ways it can hide a refusal to see. She thinks of people like Bernard, who step toward danger the way some people step toward a child.
She thinks of the scene in the studio, the tip jar, and the moment when a company turned need into content. She realizes, with a slow and dreadful clarity, that the costs of their decisions will not stop with her reputation. Outside, the city keeps breathing. People sweep sidewalks and mop buckets and late-night trash collections keep the city breathing. They do it without applause. They do it because someone has to. If this story is grabbing you, if you want to follow every twist they tried to bury, subscribe now. There's more to see. The next weeks moved like seasons, sudden and relentless. What began as a carefully timed PR moment diluted into a wider, harder light. Journalists who had once accepted company statements as fact started to ask for the records behind those statements. The first reporter's calm tweet asking for metadata turned into a request for security logs. The logs, once pried open, unraveled into meeting notes and memos that did not read like compassion, but like calculation. Tyler Brigham felt the first sharpness of consequence in a way he had never allowed himself to imagine. A donor voicemail that did not call, but hung up after 30 seconds. A trustee's curt email asking for a full accounting. The CFO spreadsheets, once the clean ledger of corporate confidence, now looked like maps to an exposed heart. Tyler fielded calls that contained fewer reassurances and more questions. He tightened his jaw. He began to draft defenses, backdate emails, and test tone for statements that might make the building look less like a machine for protecting power and more like something capable of repair. But paper could be pulled apart. A copy of an internal memo, sent to a confidant in legal, surfaced anonymously on a small but determined news site. The language in it was surgical. Frame, protect, limit exposure. The memo recommended termination pending investigation as a way to manage optics. It included the phrase Tyler had used in the recorded meeting, "This will put the story back in our control."
That line spread like a stain. People read it as evidence that for some in that company, truth had been secondary to control. With each new detail, the architecture of support around Alexandra frayed. Longtime donors called their assistants and asked for explanations. The gala that would have brought in a predictable flood of donations saw sponsors withdraw, one after another. Auctioneer calls came and went. Empty chairs gathered under stage lights. Images of the planned event, smiling donors, charity awards, were replaced by news tickers that asked whether the children in the foundation's stories were being used to shield deeper failures. Social media turned the staged clip on its head. What was designed to humanize now read as transactional.
People did not simply feel sympathy for Bernard. They recognized an exploitation pattern they had seen before. Polished hands offering thin consolation while the scaffolding that kept everyday people afloat was quietly removed. Hashtag staged sympathy, hashtag you don't ask someone to beg, and other tags built into a chorus that would not be soothed with a press release. Bernard watched the tide with a kind of wary disbelief. Vindication was not the quiet thing he had pictured. Instead, it came with noise, heated op-eds, petitions for reform, and, less welcome, a renewed spotlight on the very vulnerability the staged clip had exposed. Interviewers called him not to listen but to probe. Producers wanted sound bites. Campaigns wanted to put his face on flyers. He had said yes to one camera and a cramped studio to keep a roof over Molly's head. Now dozens wanted the man behind the plea to represent a movement. He refused some requests. He accepted others, but always on his terms. The momentum that saved Bernard's reputation also hollowed out parts of Alexandra's public life. Foundations that had been her companions for decades began to distance themselves. One by one, major partners sent curt notices. They were pausing grants, asking for audited reviews, requesting independent oversight. Corporate partners that had once lined up to co-brand a gala bowed out. The board received pointed questions from trustees who were more used to philanthropic optics than moral ambiguity, and they asked for an immediate review of practices related to staff, security, and the company foundation's operations. What the press called a cascade was less dramatic in mechanics. There were no gavel bangs and no courtroom fireworks, but it was precise and slow, a withdrawal of confidence that had financial teeth. Donor dollars were not just numbers. They were lifelines for programs and cash flows for her empire. Without them, projects stalled, payrolls tightened, and the tidy architecture of public goodwill began to leak. The portrait of Alexandra smiling at a ribbon-cutting event, once a shield, began to feel like a sign on a burning building. Alexandra felt it as a hollowing. She had been spared death at the hands of a stranger, and yet she found herself in a different kind of emergency, a moral and financial one. The sickness she had felt in the hospital room, guilt that tasted like detergent, now tasted like fear. She spent long hours in the quiet of her house, telephone calls threaded with bland legal language, and the sharp, impatient syllables of people who wanted money accounted for. She watched the footage she had asked to see again and again, as if watching glass could make it less fragile. When she reached out to Bernard the first time, it had been a tentative, small mercy, a voice on a line that sounded older to him than the woman on the stage. She had wanted to say the words she believed might make things whole. I saw. I am sorry. How can I help? But those words, when set against a backdrop of donors pulling out and memos leaking, sounded like currency and were treated like such. She tried to do the right thing within the framework she knew. Board statements, an open letter, donations diverted to a support fund. Yet every move she made was met with two responses. Relief from those who believed in the old story of her as a compassionate philanthropist, and suspicion from those who saw her actions as damage control. Tyler, meanwhile, found out the hard difference between running numbers and running a narrative. He could forecast cash, model forecasts, and write memos. He could not, at first, predict the moral velocity of public outrage. He attempted to patch things, offer a larger donation, propose an audit, schedule a forum for employees, but the offers felt like bandages on a wound that needed a surgeon's honesty. The leaked memo and the recorded line about control had already softened any trust trustees once had. He began to be a liability in the sense the company had once feared, an index finger pointing to the way decisions had been made. Employees who had been quiet for years suddenly found a public that would listen. A mid-level administrative assistant released screenshots of internal HR conversations suggesting complaints about maintenance staffing had been deprioritized.
A former security officer provided, anonymously, an account of how the security feed was selectively clipped for press. Small threads of truth came together into a cord, and that cord tugged at more than one door. The company's board convened emergency meetings. Some directors, sensing that what remained of their brand value might be destroyed, sought to distance themselves from the optics they had once cultivated. Others, more stubborn, counseled patience and a measured strategy, transparency, third-party audits, and a careful rehabilitation strategy that would require time and money. But time is a luxury that runs on donors' patience. Money is a resource donors can withdraw. The company's balance sheets began to feel the sharpened edge of public mistrust. The financial fissures deepened. Grants were paused. Partners renegotiated contracts. A long-standing sponsor publicly suspended its association pending results of an independent review. The effect on Alexandra's foundation was immediate. Projects that depended on predictable funding were put on hold. The press framed it as dominoes falling. She felt the ground shift under projects she had once called legacy. In her private world, the losses piled up in images rather than in numbers. A portrait removed from the main lobby. Invitations rescinded. A gala cancelled with a terse phrase about scheduling conflicts. The quietest, cruelest thing was how people stepped away. Friends called less often. Trustees sent polite notes with legal disclaimers. The phone calls were polite. The silences were brutal.
When the company released the full, unedited footage under pressure from public outcry, the world saw what Alexandra had seen. A man kneeling and giving everything he had to a woman life had betrayed at that moment, and people who could have moved, instead measuring the optics. The footage made a different kind of moral force visible. Not only had Bernard done what he did, but a culture had allowed indifference to gather. For many, that realization was intolerable. For donors, it was fatal to confidence. The pressure that followed was not a single strong hand, but many. Foundations suspended their multi-year commitments. Corporate partners invoked termination clauses. And individual donors, some of whom had been the underpinnings of Alexandra's philanthropic work, transferred their giving elsewhere. It was less a flash of punishment and more the slow emptying of a reservoir that had once given life to thousands of small programs. Without steady donations, payrolls on the nonprofit arm froze. Contractors were paid late. Programs that served neighborhoods were held. The foundation's balance sheet, already stressed by the corporate scandal swirling into public view, could not absorb the retreat. Some named it collapse. Others called it bankruptcy, a word that can mean different things in different contexts. In the public imagination, the image crystallized, a woman known to the world as the rich mother of charitable giving, stripped of the outward signs of security she had relied upon. Her foundation's websites changed language, then went dark. Her personal philanthropy was now under scrutiny. She sold items from a private collection to raise liquidity and closed a satellite office. Press pieces measured the transfer of trustee support into safer hands. No one celebrated. People examined the fallout with sober faces. That she ended up effectively bankrupt was not a sudden magical equalizer. It was a consequence of choices, her own and those made in the name of damage control, and of a public unwilling to continue funding an institution it perceived as having misplaced its moral compass. To some, the outcome felt justified. To others, it was an unlikely collapse that left people without programs they had counted on. The nuance mattered. The consequences were human. While the financial scaffolding around Alexandra loosened, Bernard found himself invited to places he had never imagined being. Community forums, editorial panels, a city council meeting that wanted to discuss labor rights for night shift workers. He was nervous about speaking. He had always preferred action to rhetoric. His body knew the rhythm of hard work, not the cadence of a speech. But people listened when he spoke, not because he had become famous, but because he spoke without the veneer of spin. He told the story quietly, not as a platform, but as a set of facts and a set of wishes. He asked for transparent grievance processes for employees.
He asked for living wages and clear channels to report safety concerns without fear of losing a job. He asked for security footage to be released on request to protect employees from being misrepresented. He did not want to be a symbol of retribution. He wanted structural change. A coalition formed: workers, community advocates, a few journalists, and some board members who had not fled. They proposed an employee welfare initiative, a program that would ensure living wages, an emergency fund for staff, secure reporting lines handled by an independent ombuds office, and mandatory training on dignity and de-escalation for executives. Crucially, the governance of that fund and program would include seats for worker representatives. The coalition needed legitimacy, and Bernard's name carried it. He was offered a seat at the table, a formal position in the oversight committee to the new initiative. He hesitated. He did not want to be a figurehead. He did not want to be the token face of a company still in debt, or a woman in crisis. But when he read the charter, written with input from community leaders, lawyers, and organizational ethicists, he saw something different. The charter granted workers a vote, not a veneer. It included commitments to restore wages retroactively for those who had been underpaid and to fund affordable childcare for frontline staff. It included a clause that security footage could not be edited for public consumption without worker consent. It gave the committee real oversight over how funds were allocated. Bernard accepted. He did so, in part, for Molly. He wanted a world where his daughter would not learn that visibility meant asking for help on camera. He wanted to change the terms by which companies measured reputation and human worth. The rollout of the Employee Welfare Initiative was messy, imperfect, and very public. Alexandra announced the program with a statement that, for once, did not try to smooth every edge. She spoke to reporters not in polished talking points, but in sentences that trembled with the weight of loss. She said plainly that she had misjudged the situation, and that responsibility had to be shared and repaired. For a movement hungry for accountability, the words mattered less than the structure she agreed to place under independent oversight. Her personal path toward restitution was complicated. She contributed what assets she could to fund the new initiative, sold artwork from her collection, and offered donor lists to be audited and considered for reallocation. She also stepped away from the public stage. Where once cameras found her at charity luncheons, now she attended community meetings where she listened and took notes. She met with families who had benefited from the program she had once run and offered apologies and explanations, but did not expect instant forgiveness. Some accepted her offers with guarded hope. Others refused, their wounds too recent.
There were moments that felt almost biblical in their small human detail. A woman whose after-school program had been abruptly paused confronted Alexandra in a local church basement and asked how she could trust a system that had put image above need. Alexandra listened and did not try to manufacture a fix. She offered what she could: funding, an honest audit of operations, a public commitment to worker governance, and then she stepped back to let the work itself be judged by the people it was meant to serve. The public watched, and slowly some moved toward a cautious optimism. Tyler's day-to-day unraveling was quieter. He did the thing executives do when their world collapses. He migrated from confident op-eds to terse resignation letters. He left the company with his reputation diminished. The board explained the reason publicly in a careful line about leadership transition. Internally, people whispered about his memos. For Tyler, the loss was not a moral awakening so much as a career pivot. He found a place in a consulting firm that favored data over stories, and he began, in a smaller way, to deal with the loneliness of a man who had misread the moral wind. Bernard's vindication was not an overnight coronation. The smear did not disappear as if by decree, but the threads of truth that had begun in those early, hurried tweets had tightened into lawless steadiness. The unedited footage existed, the memos existed, the pattern of privileging image over duty existed. People who had once assumed the company's benevolence now demanded accountability. In a city used to colorless settlements, there was an uneasy sense that something had shifted. As the company began to reorganize around its new constraints, certain practical things changed fast. The Employee Welfare Initiative got seed funding, an ombuds office was established with legal independence and a neutral third-party auditor. Security protocols were rewritten. Any footage intended for public dissemination required worker consent, and HR procedures were revised to ensure complaints would not be dismissed as optics issues. Wages for cleaning staff and maintenance were increased. Retroactive compensation was calculated for a group of workers who proved they had been paid below living standards for years. Bernard negotiated for more than a title. He insisted on real authority. When the committee convened, he sat across from Alexandra and men like Tyler, and he did not allow the conversation to be reduced to the kind of soft language the PR machine relied upon. He demanded transparency, accountability, and a fund that did not disappear when donors decided they had had enough. He set boundaries. He would not be paraded for fundraising fardos. He would not lend his name to campaigns that sought to make him a symbol. He asked for a simple measure, a direct line to report when staff were mistreated, paid, or endangered. He insisted on housing support and childcare stipends for single parents.
He argued for mental health services for employees who had been through public trauma. There were heated moments. There were times when the old architecture fought back with clauses that sounded like progress but smelled like spin. Bernard navigated those moments with a steadiness learned from the long night shifts and the nights of stove-cold dinners. People noticed. Molly came to a few sessions with him, small and wide-eyed, and the image of a father carrying both his daughter's homework and the weight of a company's moral repair moved more than a few hearts. Journalists covered the meetings not as voyeurism, but as civic documentation. People in the neighborhood said with a cautious pride that Bernard had changed the language of what it meant to run a company that served a city.
For Alexandra, the change was mixed. Some doors closed permanently. Places that had once been open to her now required a longer process of trust building. She had to learn, in small, humiliating ways, to show up not as a donor with a ledger, but as a neighbor who might have made mistakes. She found that listening required a different kind of bravery than giving. Where she had once believed that her funds would guarantee good outcomes, she now had to accept that oversight would measure whether her dollars were used well. She held back some of her pride to sign off on audits that critiqued work she had once commissioned. She sold a house and moved into a smaller one. She spent evenings writing letters to program leaders, not for cameras, but as a practical mode of repair. There were private scenes, too, that the press did not see. On a late winter evening, Alexandra walked into a small community center and sat near the back while Bernard spoke about dignity and the cost of being invisible. She listened. Afterward, she waited until most people had left and asked quietly where she might help that would not be a performance. Bernard did not make her the villain of the story. He said simply, "Do the work, let us design it together. Don't put your signature on it and call it fixed." It was a request that stripped away the kind of absolution donors like to give. She agreed. Some accused him of forgiveness. Others said the gesture showed he had lost nothing in principle. The truth, as has true for most such stories, was messier. Bernard did not forgive because he was magnanimous. He engaged because he wanted structural guarantees for people like him, and because he did not want his daughter to learn to accept indignity. He wanted restitution in the shape of policy and wage and respect. In the months that followed, the company, what remained of it, reorganized. Donors who had once been uncritical began to acquire third-party oversight to continue supporting social programs. Boards were reconstituted. The foundation shrank and then was reconstituted under community governance.
Alexandra's public persona changed from that of the untouchable philanthropist to a private figure doing the harder work of repair. She rarely spoke on television. Instead, she sat in basements and listened, and offered resources without fanfare. Financially, the outcome for Alexandra could be summarized as severe loss. Her public empire had largely unraveled, and she had to liquidate assets to cover obligations. The language of bankrupt circulated in headlines and in private conversation. It was shorthand for a fall from patronage to scarcity. She had fewer privileges. Where once she had access to rooms filled with sympathetic donors, she now had to show up and do the labor of rebuilding trust. Bernard, by contrast, kept his dignity. He was offered a modest salary to chair the Worker Oversight Committee, and, crucially, he had a voice in how funds would be dispersed. He used the position not to aggrandize himself, but to push for protections. He insisted on housing assistance for families at risk of eviction, and on a childcare stipend that would allow single parents to keep work. He set up a small emergency fund with community partners, money that was not underwritten by a single wealthy benefactor, but by dozens of small donors and public grants. He helped oversee the rollout of a guaranteed training program so that workers could move into better jobs. At home, life rearranged. Molly's shoes did not have holes that winter. Bernard still cleaned offices at night, but less out of necessity and more because he liked the rhythm. He began to teach a community CPR course at the church basement where he had once learned, an ironic loop that made sense of his life. He taught others the skills that had saved Alexandra and that kept his family whole. He took pride in that, not in headlines. And Alexandra, whose public life had contracted, found a different kind of company. She lost events in glossy magazine profiles, but she gained the slow work of oversight tables. There were nights she would sit alone with a cup of tea and think of the portrait that had been removed from the lobby. The silence was not comfort. It was an unedited space where she had to live with her choices. She tried to make what she had left count in ways that could not be simply consumed. The city itself changed in small ways. Nonprofits that had never considered worker governance adopted elements of the Employee Welfare Initiative. A coalition of foundations formed a compact around transparent practices, insisting that worker representation was not optional. The conversation about dignity in the workplace extended beyond one scandal and into a broader debate about how institutions valued the people who kept them running. There were moments of bitterness, of course. People resented the idea that someone who had been wealthy could be reduced and yet still retain influence. There were recriminations that Bernard had not sought. There were those who felt Alexandra's losses were insufficient. There were others who thought her punishment had been excessive. Public conversation, as ever, was messy. What was undeniable was that the spectacle of asking a man to beg for help on camera had become a public parable. It had shown how systems can co-opt need into content, and how content can be weaponized to defend institutions.
The cascade that followed, leaked memos, donor withdrawals, governance reform, was not merely a personal downfall. It was a demonstration of systemic accountability. Institutions that treat people as props cannot expect the props to stay silent forever. In the quiet, Bernard continued to live the small life that mattered most. He and Molly rode a bus together to school and sometimes stopped at a diner for pancakes on the way. He taught CPR in the church basement and sat on the oversight committee, where his voice carried weight that once would have been unimaginable in boardrooms. He refused offers to join slick fundraising campaigns. He accepted a few interviews in community papers, stories about dignity rather than spectacle. The final public exchange between him and Alexandra was not an on-stage forgiveness or a viral moment. It was a meeting in a community center with a dozen people watching. Alexandra came not as a celebrity, but as someone with a checkbook and a willingness to listen. Bernard read from prepared notes. She spoke second, briefly, and then she sat down and listened to the people who had once been behind the scenes. The rest of the conversation belonged to those who had been waiting for a long time to be heard. When it was over, Bernard walked outside into the late sun with Molly clinging to his hand. They paused at the corner where the city cleaned its own face. He watched his daughter knee the curb and kick up a pile of leaves. She laughed, the sort of laughter that did not need an audience. He felt something like relief, not a neat closure, but a steadier horizon. He had been used, then misused, then cleaned up. He had been humiliated and then vindicated. The social repairs were imperfect, but they were real. That for him was what counted. Alexandra watched from a distance more often than she would like to admit. She had lost the easy pedestal, but she had not lost the capacity to act. In a small kitchen now, the photograph of her smiling with ribbons gone from the mantel, she wrote long letters to program leaders and signed checks with hands that shook in ways unrelated to money. She made mistakes. She learned in public where to be quiet and where to act. The bankruptcy that the headlines had relished was finally less a spectacle of revenge and more a collapse that forced accountability. Her losses taught a lesson about the cost of protecting image over people. The city kept moving. Janitors swept, nurses changed shifts, clerks balanced tills.
The small acts of cleaning, of teaching CPR, of sitting at oversight meetings built a new scaffolding that did not rely solely on spectacle. Bernard kept teaching his class in the basement church, hands steady, voice low and clear. He would sometimes catch the eye of a young man in the back and nod. That young man might someday be the one kneeling when a person collapses, and he would do what Bernard had done without thinking of cameras. On a late spring evening, Bernard sat on the stoop outside his building, Molly asleep at his side after a day at the playground. He watched the lights come on in windows up and down the block. He thought of the ordinary dignity of people who kept the city running, and the extraordinary way in which a single act of courage had set off a reckoning that neither he nor Alexandra had sought. She had asked him, in a press plan designed by people who valued optics, to beg for tips. What happened next was not a comic punishment, nor a feast of schadenfreude. It was a slow, messy accounting. It left her without the public pedestal she had relied upon, a form of financial collapse that unlatched privileges and demanded new practices. It left Bernard with a seat at the table he had never been invited to before. It left the city with a model that, imperfect and contested, insisted that institutions be judged by how they treated those who made them possible. Bernard tightened his coat around him and smiled, thinking of Molly's small, warm hands. He had been seen, then unseen, then seen again. That seeing had come at a cost, for everyone, but it had also made room, just a little, for a different kind of future, one where people were less often made props, and where the dignity of work mattered in the balance sheets as much as net worth. If you believe workplaces should protect the vulnerable, share this story and leave your thoughts below. The kind of change Bernard fought for depends on many voices, and this conversation is only beginning.